Hello and welcome. This is Business Edge right here on News Central. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. First, the headlines. Kenya ends COVID-19 tax relief. And the African Development Bank Fund approved $71.5 million loan for roads in Uganda. We'll have the details of these stories with our guest, and of course, we'll be wrapping things up with NC4 to watch right here on Business Edge. Welcome to the show. And again, we are here right here on News Central for Business Edge. Let's get straight into it. Now, Kenya has terminated parts of the tax relief measures extended to cushion households and businesses from the adverse impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic. Kenya's National Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukar Yatana issued a statement saying that the corporate tax rate has become 30% from 25%, while the value-added tax, that's VAT, is now 16% from 14%. The Treasury clarified that these are not new tax rates, but just a return to prevailing tax rates before the pandemic. The government will continue to cushion low-income earners by retaining 100% tax exemption or relief for those earning monthly incomes of 24,000 Kenyan shillings or about $240 and below. The announcement comes as it emerged that Kenya's risk of debt distress increased from moderate to high as the government's debt accumulation closes in on the 9 trillion Kenyan shillings or $90 billion ceiling, breaching several debt sustainability indicators and narrowing the space for additional borrowing. With close to half of the total revenue collections going towards debt repayment, Yatani faces a difficult task in financing government operations and infrastructure development projects. Kenya's apex bank says the country's risk of debt distress has been exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic. Now, to help make sense of these developments is Chibamba Kanyama. He's a managing consultant for Bridges Limited, also an economist and a former International Monetary Fund communications advisor. Chibamba, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you so much. Greetings.
All right. So let's look at this in terms of the decision about ending tax relief for businesses and for Kenyans. Would this not cause some kind of contraction of the economy?
I doubt. I don't think it will. It actually signals to Kenyan citizens.
Continue. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's actually signaling to the Kenyan investors, Kenyan citizens, and everybody that the commercial loans are becoming a risky area to go into. And therefore, the recovery of the Kenyan economy will largely depend on Kenyan businesses. Okay. So they have to fund the recovery, and the longer the tax relief is in place, the worse economic recovery will be for Kenya. The area the lead is lifted, the area that the economy of Kenya will be on a path to recovery by using internally generated resources.
So we see that the corporate tax rates and the value-added tax rates are going back to pre-lockdown rates. And we know that Kenya's government, like many governments across the continent, like many governments across the world because of the pandemic, they need money. What do we think investors will make of this in terms of the corporate tax rates and the VAT going up? Will investors want to come into Kenya at this moment? And it may not just be Kenya that will feel the pinch when it comes to investors. Or what will this look like for those considering investments in Kenya?
Two things. Number one, on corporate taxes, most of the companies we know in Kenya have a way of what we call creative accounting, where they pay almost no tax, most of them. And they have a way of avoiding paying taxes by increasing levels of costs associated with production. And at the end of the day, many of them don't really declare a profit, especially the multinationals. Those are the investors that you're concerned about.
Okay.
I do not think that they will get worried now, because even those about to enter the Kenyan economy, they still have a number of exclusions. They have exemptions that they enjoy, some of them lasting as far as 3 to 5 years, where they don't pay corporate taxes by virtue of being new as entry benefits. So I do not see that will affect the appetite to go into Kenya. On the value-added tax, yes, it may impact on one side. It may impact on demand for products and services. As you know, that the actual payer of VAT is the consumer, not the end payer of value-added taxes. The only impact on businesses is that it increases the cost of products, the goods that are produced by industry, and it affects demand for these products. And given the scenario where we're coming from, that demand is already subdued because of COVID, and then you're increasing VAT, the capacity for industry to produce is a little bit limited.
Yeah.
However, the minister has been a little bit clever on this one. He says, we shall still retain 100% enjoyment of tax relief for households under a certain threshold.
Yeah.
Those who continue. So what he's actually saying is, while the cost of products will be higher now from the relief tax VAT to 16 or whatever percent, the demand will still be there somehow, because it has not affected disposable incomes. The households will still enjoy this tax relief beyond the deadline of this month.
Okay. Okay, so it's interesting because we know that taxes play a really fundamental part in Kenya's budgeting process. And looking at a statement from the Kenya Revenue Authority, they said that they significantly fund the national budget through taxes. But it was not just taxes and reduction of the corporate or value-added tax that government looked at when the pandemic was on. Let me quickly list a few other things that they also put in place as well. There was suspension of all listing for all persons, including companies, at the Credit Reference Bureau. They lowered the central bank rate to 7.2%. They lowered the cash reserve ratio to 4.2%. The CBK also offered flexibility to the banks on loans that were active as of March 2020 to maintain liquidity levels. They facilitated expedited payment of VAT refunds by allocating additional 10 billion Kenyan shillings. They also set up a fund to which players in the public and private sector are contributing to support government's efforts to fight coronavirus. So we see all these other things that have been done. Are any of these also going to get a reversal? It's very easy for us to focus on the tax conversation because that's the one that tends to affect a number of people across board. But are any of these other measures also going to see a reversal in the time as the new year comes in?
Yeah, I would single out the central bank rate. Though that is usually negotiated among all the East African countries, they have to collaborate among themselves. That's Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and others in the Central African monetary system. They have to agree on that rate. But I foresee that within the next 6 months, when the next rate by the central bank is announced, it may increase. The reason being that when they reduced the rate, they were really working on reactivating, rejuvenating the economy, unlocking system so that there is enough liquidity. The focus was to increase liquidity into the system and therefore impact on demand. And once you do that, it helps to unlock industry. The elephant in the room, which nobody's really talking about, the inflationary pressure that Kenya is confronting. This, to me, is the major storm that must be contained early enough, because the potential impact of high inflation is not only for Kenya, is almost everywhere Kenya is exporting. It impacts on its exports. It impacts on the household income because the power or the capacity for households to buy the same commodities using the same amount of money is completely reduced.
Yep.
Therefore, the central bank will need to revisit this before it happens. A lot of the economies that lowered the policy rate are already contending, number one, contending with unstable exchange rate, and therefore facing higher levels of imported inflation. And two, they are actually facing a lot of liquidity into the system, which doesn't match with the level of production into the economy. And I foresee that the central bank will very quickly respond in the next announcement to increase the policy rate.
Okay.
And of course, there could be higher interest rates for industry, but I think that the better route to take after we have contained COVID.
Okay. Chibamba, we're going to take a quick break, but I also want you to think about this question, and one that comes up with many African governments, and that is the cost of governance on the continent. What part of their own responsibility is Kenya's government looking at in terms of reducing their own expenditure, and how much they cost the Kenyan populace, as it may be? We'll get into that, and then right after that, we'll move our conversation to Uganda, where they have received a loan in Uganda for the financing of roads. And these roads are to very important locations, tourist destinations, as it may be. That conversation will come up right after this break. So before we move to our Uganda story, let's wrap up that conversation on tax relief, in the era of COVID in Kenya. So Chibamba, I asked you before we went on a break, what about government reducing its own expenditure? This is a conversation that happens across the continent, and more people are worried about the cost of governance versus how much the commensurate value that Africans across the continent are actually getting in place of what we're paying for our governance. So are we seeing any moves by Kenya's government to actually reduce their own expenditure and also find a way to reduce what they cost the public?
Yeah, first of all, the economic equation is a difficult one. When you talk about tax, government usually plays with two equations, what I call the left hand and the right hand. When you reduce taxes, you are denying yourselves that income as a country, the treasury. So you are empowering the private sector, you're empowering the citizens to make their own decisions about how to distribute these resources. However, given the path that Kenya is taking now, that we're reverting to the old tax regime, you are simply reorganizing responsibilities and accountabilities from the private sector to the government itself, that we are the ones to distribute these resources. The major challenge here is who is the most responsible to meeting these needs. Should we entrust the government to manage these resources? This is a very difficult question because, number one, if government does not do it now, it's impacting on its fiscal position. Yeah. And whenever the fiscal position is disturbed, it's lower than budgeted for. It impacts on the deficit, and whenever there's a deficit, it destabilizes the tax system, and therefore who pays the price? It's still the same private sector, because government will still go out of the market to borrow and crowds out the private sector. So you still pay the price. And therefore, who is the most trusted agent? In the Kenyan system, President Kenyatta has, in the past 2 years, really come out very strong on combating what I call rent-seeking behavior, which is corruption. Okay. And this is where we're seeing a lot of money leaking out. Lack of accountability in the government procurement systems, overpricing of projects, and this is where there has been significant leakages. And at times, some of the projects that were contracted for were not even executed, and yet money was dispensed. When government is trusted, when government is accountable, when government is transparent in its disbursement of resources, the private sector, the taxpayer, will trust it more. And there's no other better signal than people willing to pay taxes because they trust their government.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there's very little headroom at the moment for government to reduce expenditure. I mean, the minister simply said we want to revert the old system so that we can continue with the project. And can those projects be suspended for a little while? My proposal and my recommendation is let us have a priority list. Prioritize which projects require urgent attention, and if some of the infrastructure projects can wait a little longer to ensure that there's a total full recovery for the economy, let us take that particular route.
Okay, so let's move this conversation now. Sure. Yeah, let's move the conversation now to what's happening in Uganda. Now, the African Development Fund, which is part of the African Development Bank Group, has approved a $71.5 million loan for the improvement of roads in one of Uganda's high-end tourist destinations in the southwestern districts of Kabale and Kisoro. The African Development Fund board said in a statement that the loan has been approved since December the 3rd. It will finance sections of 2 roads that will ease movement and connectivity to the popular tourist destinations of Lake Bunyoyi and Mangahinga National Park. Now, the lake is the second deepest lake in Africa and also known for luxury island hotel resorts, while the park is famous for mountain gorillas and golden monkeys. The lender explains that the central element of the project is to upgrade and pave 34 kilometers of the Kabale Lake Bunyoyi Kabeho circuits and the Kisoro Magahinga Park Gates Road, as well as construct 2 roadside markets, farm produce holding facilities, and 4 ferry landing sites at the lake. So this is something that we see happening. This is a partner to the African Development Bank, or a subsidiary as we might call it, that is now working with Uganda as well. And these 2 roads will aid Uganda in her economic recovery, but can they also pay for themselves in terms of tolling or tourist revenue? We know that tourist sites across the world are hit, and countries that are dependent on tourism, it's being said that they're going to find it harder to recover from the coronavirus. So what do we think in terms of these roads being able to pay for themselves in the near future?
I think for me, the payback will not come from whether it's toll gates or what. If they do put the toll gates, that will be one quick low-lying fruit from where the Ugandan government may recover the money. And of course, this money has to be paid back. It's an investment by both the African Development Bank and Kenyan and Ugandan government, who are putting about $11.9 million US as well as counterpart fund towards the project. But the real gain for me, it's not in the short run. It's in both the middle term and long term. And this is through what we call the backward and forward linkages in the value chain. When you unlock the economy through infrastructure investment targeted at tourism, the benefit may not accrue to government directly through taxes. It will benefit to the communities. Those are the individuals that still sit under the government social safety net, who benefit from government expenditure. Now you are directly benefiting those citizens lying along that 35-kilometer stretch of Uganda. So the gains from tourism, the gains from local participation, the gains from agricultural activity, where the pricing of the goods and the farm produce will now be at proper market value. And also an increase, what we call the social benefit of an increase in school enrollment. These are the benefits that shall accrue to this particular community. And I'm not sure whether you can quantify this investment or this benefit. However, there'll be 2 streams, of course, through targets and through backward and forward linkages through the value chains. Okay,
and very quickly before we wrap up, looking at the bigger picture in terms of after taking off, now we won't even count weeks, we're counting days to after. This project will help in putting Uganda on track for the African Continental Free Trade Area. What other areas do you think government should work on to ensure smooth takeoff and participation in this continent-wide trade deal?
I will say the government of Uganda, number one, should invest much more in security, especially along the northern side. It's not yet totally secure yet. Investment in security has a socio-economic dividend for the whole country. That's number one. Number two is to invest a lot more in the air traffic transport, the Entebbe airport. There must be significant investment in that airport, because if you really want to compete and participate in the free trade area now, you need to have a proper gateway where produce can be transported by road as well as by rail. I mean, road, by rail, as well as by air, because the market is becoming wider, and you can only compete if you invest across all the three, what we call the three areas of infrastructure and trade movements. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Chibamba Kanyama, for joining me, managing consultant, Bridges Limited, also an economist and former IMF Communications advisor. We look forward to having you back again sometime soon. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Have a pleasant day. All right, as we wrap up this edition of the show, let's get into NC4 to watch. And we start in the southern part of the continent, where South Africa's Deputy Finance Minister, David Masondo, has reassured pension fund managers that the changing regulatory environment would not give the government power over their savings. He told a roundtable about the role of pension funds in economic recovery and growth that government would leave such decisions to the fund's trustees. And still talking about pensions, about 26,458 workers who lost their jobs since the COVID-19 pandemic started taking its toll on the economy withdrew 14.79 billion naira from their retirement savings accounts in 10 months. Records from the Nigerian National Pension Commission revealed that more job losers could continue to approach their pension fund administrators to access part of their funds in their retirement savings. According to the Pension Reform Act 2014, a worker who loses his job can withdraw 25% of his RSA after waiting for 4 months without getting another paid employment. Former Malawian President Peter Mutharika is taking the country's anti-corruption body to court over his bank accounts. Mutharika approached the courts in an attempt to have the Anti-Corruption Bureau, ACB, unfreeze his bank accounts. And finally, in Morocco, the central bank reserves are showing signs of a return to normalcy. The country's central bank, Bank Al Maghreb, announced that its reserves stood at $291.6 billion. That's about $32.52 billion by November 27th of this year, up by 18.1% compared to the same period in 2019. In the last week of November, namely between November 26th and December the 2nd, the bank injected about 103.8 billion MAD, the statement also noted. And that's it on this edition of the show. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Head to our website, follow us on our social media accounts to get the latest business and financial news from across the continent. Until next time, I'm Tolulope. Adeleru-Balogun.